Welcome everyone to session 2 of our Understanding Genocide History, Causes, and Responses, led of course by the esteemed Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Over today and our last session, we will embark on a thought-provoking journey exploring the historical origins of genocide, its legal definitions, key post-Holocaust events that continue to shape our understanding of this grave human atrocity. In today's session, we'll analyze the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted in 1948. The definition will focus on the legal framework established by the convention and the definitions and provisions, the challenges associated with its implementation and enforcement. We'll also today look at the political and diplomatic processes that led to the adoption of the convention and its impact on international law. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I'm Ellen Resnick, the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. At CWB, we are dedicated to providing immersive, transformative professional development opportunities for educators through unique travel and virtual learning experiences. Over the past 13 years, we've engaged with over 87,000 participants from more than 600 virtual programs, connecting individuals from across the globe to explore critical issues and open minds and hearts. Your participation and support are essential to our mission, and if you'd like to contribute to our ongoing efforts, the donation link is going to be in the chat for you in just a moment. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Dr. Berenbaum is a writer, lecturer, and consultant specializing in the development of museums and historical films. He directs the Ziggy Ziering Institute at the American Jewish University, where he's also a professor of Jewish studies. He served as the executive director of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica and was president of the survivors of the Shoah Visual Historical Foundation. Dr. Berenbaum played a key role in creating the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and authored the report to the president on the President's Commission on the Holocaust. He has written and edited over 20 books, contributed to the design of several Holocaust museums, and is actively working on memorial projects worldwide. Today, he is joining us from Poland. Please send any questions you have to Michael via the chat, and we will do our best to address them throughout the session. And with that, Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, just for you, it's good afternoon, but I must tell you that I begin this in a startling fashion. Poland, unbeknownst to me, had changed its clock and is no longer on daylight savings time. So when I sat down to dinner, I thought I had an hour and a half to sit down to dinner because I was presuming the difference between Poland and the East Coast is 6 hours. Lo and behold, the difference between Poland and the East Coast is 5 hours. And I had ordered my dinner and had begun my course when, lo and behold, Ellen, with all of her preparation, texts me in a hurry that where am I and when am I going to begin? So we may be interrupted with room service as I as they bring my food up. Not that I will eat now, but I just didn't want to stick the restaurant, having ordered food and everything else. The other thing is we're going to correct Ellen's introduction to what I'm going to deal with, because I'm going to deal with the 10 stages of genocide today. And the reason for that is I bought a brand new computer and I do not have my lecture on the Genocide Convention on this computer yet, but I did prepare for this session by having the 10 stages of genocide. So you will forgive Ellen for making a rash assumption, or for me for not following Ellen's assumption. But presuming that you folks know me well enough to understand that that I do prepare for these sessions and I do consider them very seriously. So let's begin with a double apology, and you will understand that I do not somehow did not understand the very basic thing that Poland is only 5 hours different than the United States. instead of 6 hours different. And lo and behold, we now have the question of when do times change in different countries. And in the United States, they will change this Saturday night, to the best of my recollection, and the like. So let's begin. Um, Gregory Stanton, who has been a scholar of genocide, um, gave a speech to the State Department that became very influential in articulating the stages of genocide. I don't necessarily agree that we can distinguish between each of the stages as clearly as he believes that we can distinguish between the stages of genocide. But his vocabulary, I think, is quite instructive and informative in terms of the understanding of genocide. And the other part of it that's quite good, especially for those of us who are students of the Holocaust, is we will be able to identify in each stage of genocide precisely as policy evolved and as it took form. Naturally, Stanton was deeply influenced by the Holocaust itself, which is not only a classical case of genocide, but has with great clarity and with precision all the elements of genocide. And he will enable us to understand a whole range of other genocides and also the stages that lead to genocide in a very important way. So I'm going to share my screen, and as we share the screen, you'll begin to understand precisely where we are and what it represents in terms of the 10 stages of genocide. Let me go through them, and then we'll go through them in an articulated fashion. The 10 stages of genocide, by the way, when he first gave the lecture, the interesting thing is he did not speak about 10 stages of genocide. He spoke about 8 stages of genocide. And then he further corrected itself in a very basic way. The first stage of genocide that he speaks about is classification. And that is, the classification is cultures distinguished between us and them, ethnicity, race, religion, German and Jew, Hutu and Tutsi. If societies are divided, they are more likely to have genocide. And the best way of presenting genocide at this stage is to develop the opportunity for societies to live together from different ethnic, social, and religious backgrounds. This will allow people to become tolerant and understand each other. In the United States, public schools serve this function and admit all regardless of it. And this is a common ground which is critical to the prevention of genocide. Classification in the Holocaust, you'll remember, is the very important classification of Jew and Aryan. And this was enacted into law in 1935. And to think of how, what shall we say, unusual that sounds, imagine if we divided our society into Americans and Jews. Or I'm now in Poland, and you understand that in Poland you have a very deep division, and the vocabulary is clearly understood because they speak of Poles and Jews, even as Jews had lived in Poland for 700 years, 700 plus years. The language was Jews and Poles and Jews, because part of what it meant to be a Pole was to be a Roman Catholic Pole. And for a long time, part of what it meant to be American, and we have this even embedded in our Constitution, which thankfully has been amended and changed. Part of what it meant to be an American was to be a white male American, because African Americans were considered 3/5 of a human being. Classification became again Hutu and Tutsi. And interestingly enough, as we're going to discover in the genocide in Rwanda, because ethnicity was established on the basis of the father, what you had in a very real sense was sometimes people ended up murdering people that we would consider nephews and nieces, meaning blood relatives who are on the other side of the classification. By the way, think of the attention we pay and the attention it regards in our society today when we begin to classify people in all sorts of ways. So classification may also have positive identity formulation, but the question is us and them. Who is us? Who are we? And what is the nature of classification? And by the way, if you think of it in quasi-religious terms, and I've been reading Rabbi Yitz Greenberg's important new book, if you begin to say that the essential classification is human being, children of God, created as it were in the image of God, then there's no othering. There's no outsider, there's no sense of the other. But one of the elements of genocide, present in all genocides, not necessarily leading to genocide, but present in all genocide, is what we would call classification. I hope that's clear, and we'll go on and look at it in another element. Symbolization. Now, again, symbolization becomes very clear in the Holocaust history. And I could ask you if we're a class and we could have the interaction. Clearly, what is symbolization? Symbolization is the Jewish star. In most countries, it was the yellow star worn on the chest. In Poland, it was the white armband. In Warsaw, in particular, it was the white armband worn on the white wrist. In some countries, you had a Jewish star front and back, and that is symbolization, which is a way of doing it. Now, symbolization also, by the way, has positive elements. Ultra-religious Jews or what we call Haredi Jews end up being symbolized by wearing what? Long black kaftans and black hats. I was at the airport in London. Uh, I'm not bragging, but I was at the airport in London on Monday, and I ran into a group of yeshiva boys, all of whom were defined by wearing black suit and a white shirt. So symbolization is not a negative. Muslim women who are pious are symbolized by what? By covering their hair, as are religious Jewish women. You have some Arabs are symbolized by the kafiyah. So symbolization is present in all sorts of places, but symbolization is a way of, especially if it's a negative symbolization and a symbolization from the outside and a symbolization that is imposed, then symbolization is we give names or other symbols, classification, ethnic, race, or nationality. We name persons Jews or Gypsies, distinguishing them by color, apply them to members of a group. Classification and symbolization are universals. They do not necessarily result in genocide unless they lead to a stage of dehumanization. When combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of a minority group. The yellow star for Jews under Nazi rule, the blue scarf for people from the Eastern Zone and the Khmer Rouge of Cambodia. You also had symbolization for intellectuals in Cambodia, was even those who wore glasses. And that is that if you wore glasses, you were symbolized as being what? An intellectual and an urbanite, and consequently, you were vulnerable. Symbolization, again, has tremendously important positive elements, especially when it's welcomed. And symbolization has deeply important negative possibilities when it's unwelcome. Think of, by the way in our ordinary life, we use a whole range of symbols to make political points. I'm wearing today a um, a metal necklace, a metal statement which says, "Bring them home," which is a statement of solidarity with the what? With the people who are in the people who are in the Jews who have been kidnapped and are held hostage, the hostages in Gaza. Many of you wear T-shirts that have symbols on it. In the old days, we used to make the symbol of peace, and we all have circles. On days when we're combating, for example, breast cancer, you have people in the major leagues of baseball even wearing what? Pink sneakers and pink and pink shoes as a way of symbolization. And symbolization has something important. Symbols also impose, we impose on ourselves. Gangs use colors. And my son went to the University of Michigan, and Michigan uses blue and yellow. And everywhere that he goes, if he's wearing a Michigan cap, and remember, a Michigan cap is a symbolization. What do the people say to him? Go blue, which is a positive sense of symbolization. But if we use it negatively, it has an incredible power to isolate, segregate, and the like. Now, let's also pay attention to this in American racial history, because part of what you did not have to do was to symbolize African Americans because they had black skin. That meant that, and only certain segments of that population could, quotation marks, pass, and that is pretend to be white. And by the way, and there was years ago a very interesting book that was almost modeled on the Academy Award winning film Gentleman's Agreement. And that was a book called Black Like Me, about a man who had dark skin and darkened his skin, and essentially, even though he was white, could pass as black, and then experience the entire element of segregation and racial animus in the United States without the generations of tough skin. He felt all of the slights as if they were brand new, as if they had never happened before, and wrote an enormously powerful book about it, what it was like, in the same way that the Academy Award film that came out right after the Holocaust had a man by the name of Mr. Green, um, who, which is a name in between, not like a Goldberg or a Cohn. And Mr. Green was a non-Jew who pretended to be Jewish, and all of a sudden got into a whole range of challenges because he was symbolized as such. To combat symbolization, hate symbols can be legally forbidden. Swastikas, as also hate speech. Sometimes group markings like gang clothing or tribal scanning can be outlawed as well. this becomes problematic in the United States in particular. Sometimes if we outlaw, denial of symbols can be seen as powerful as it was in Bulgaria when many non-Jews chose to wear the yellow star. According to legend, in Denmark, the Nazis did not introduce the yellow star because they knew that even the king would wear it. By the way, the yellow star was never introduced into Denmark. And part of the reason is because they did not believe that the population would accept it. And one of the achievements of the Dane that led ultimately to the rescue of Jews from Denmark is they felt Jews to be fellow citizens of Denmark. And because they were fellow citizens of Denmark, they reacted to an attack on them as you would respond to what? To fellow citizens who were being attacked by a hostile occupying army and by a hostile occupying nation. So symbolization becomes very important. And we see the symbolization, and one of the measures of anti-Semitism in the United States is a discussion as to whether one can walk freely and behave freely with the symbols that we've been accustomed to doing. Some people are saying, do we have to take the mezuzah, the amulet that is on the right doorpost of a Jewish home, do we have to take it off because what? Because it's a symbol? The question is, do we have, can we walk in the street with a yarmulke on, with a kippah covering our head, or is that to be symbolized? And one of the most powerful stories of combating hatred in the history of the United States occurred in a place called Billings, Montana. And I don't know how many of you know the story of Billings, but it's worth retelling and retelling all the way through. In Billings, Montana, there were 80 Jews in a town of about 40,000. And during Christmas time, when houses are decorated with Christmas trees and with wreaths and the like, and when Jews have a Hanukkah menorah, the candelabra in the window, somebody threw a brick through the home of a conductor of the orchestra in Billings, Montana. It ended up going through a child's room. And then you had an incredibly powerful community response. The pastor of a church ordered a series of menorahs and gave them out to his church and said that if we are to be symbolized by hatred because of the menorah, I want each of you to put a menorah in your home so that the haters, if they come back, cannot distinguish between Jewish homes and Christian homes because everybody has a menorah. This was picked up by the newspaper, which printed a full page picture of a menorah, and people started posting that on their homes and in their windows. And that essentially was a way that group solidarity and group cohesion said, we're not going to be the haters. We're going to put a symbol that is negative and make it a symbol of solidarity. And we can use symbols in a very important and very significant way. I hope this is clear. Let's go on to the next stage. And one of the terrible things about Zoom is that if I were teaching class with all of you on the same screen without sharing my screen, I could see a couple of people smile and nod their head and say, okay, you've made the point. Now I understand what symbolization is. And one of the terrible things about, and Zoom gives me a tremendous opportunity because this way I'd have to travel to Pittsburgh. You would all have to travel in, and my friend Barbara Goldstein would have to come in from Tallahassee. Instead, she's comfortable in Tallahassee, Florida, or uncomfortable in Tallahassee, Florida. and the like. But one of the negative parts, especially for those of us who are teachers, is you can't see people smiling and nodding, and therefore you don't quite know if the point has been made. But I'm going to presume that even I, with my terribly weak teaching skills, can make the point and we can understand it. This is where we come to a clear sense, which is discrimination. And that is a dominant group uses law, custom, political power to deny the rights of the other group. The powerless group may not be given full civil rights or even citizenship, and therefore they do not have the full ability to participate. Discrimination, we all understand in all sorts of ways, the ways in which we discriminate and are discriminated against. Prevention means full political empowerment and citizenship for the rights of all groups in a society. Discrimination on the basis of nationality, ethnicity, race, religion should be outlawed. Individuals should have the right to sue the state, corporation, and other individuals if their rights are violated. This is a measure of prevention. Discrimination, by the way, he has the next stage is dehumanization, which is, and I have to say, and I don't mean to make it political, even if it sounds political, the moment we speak of people in dehumanizing terms who are other in discrimination, we sanction a certain amount of animus and hatred, and that is that we condemn them not only as individuals because of conduct, but as members of a group. So if you began to say you know, for example, there are rapists and the rapists are illegal aliens. They're also white members of elite groups that are also rapists. The crime we should condemn is rape. And if we have and we don't have a disproportionate notion of it, but dehumanization makes them less than human. Dehumanization, when one group treats another group as second class, members of a persecuted group may be compared with animals, parasites, insects, or diseases. When a group of people is thought of as less than human, it's easier for the group in control to murder them. Wow, does that make a political point at this moment in our discourse? And I did not, this is, I copied this off the website of the 10 stages of genocide. So I hate it makes a point about the discourse that we've been having in our society. It makes a terrible point about the discourse we've been having in our society and should put us all a little bit morally on edge in terms of the way in which language has been flowing in our society. By the way, the same can be said about other parts of language when we begin to talk like that and the like. Hate propaganda in print or hate radio is used. And by the way, radio was used most particularly in Rwanda, where all of a sudden the signal was given by radio. In fighting this dehumanization, this dehumanization, one must remember there's no right of freedom of speech to tell people to commit murder. In the same way, freedom of speech ends, as it were, when you yell fire in a crowded theater. Outlawing hate speech can help save lives of those who are targeted. If a country is on the verge of committing genocide, it's no longer democracy if it was before, and the broad freedom of speech protected in a democracy may need to be limited in such a country. Hate radio stations should be shut down, hate propaganda banned, hate crimes and atrocities should be promptly punished. Again, I don't necessarily agree with every one of the suggestions of Gregory Stanton, but I'm presenting his work to you because it is one of the defining works. And hate speech is one of the things that we call out. And remember, we have a certain progress in the United States because we have a group of crimes that are called what? Hate crimes. And there's an additional penalty with regard to hate crimes if there's a particular animus. By the way, sometimes you have a refusal, an inability to see a hate crime as a hate crime in a very particular way. I want to think of a particular example that happened with the um, attack on the synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. The head of the FBI in Texas, in Dallas, said this was not an anti-Semitic incident. He regarded it as an act of terrorism, without considering that the person who went to the synagogue specifically chose a synagogue because he thought that he had embedded a whole range of propaganda about Jews controlling the world. He wanted to speak to the rabbi of the central synagogue, believing that he had uncovered the plot of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, not understanding that the Central Synagogue in New York was called the Central Synagogue because it's next to Grand Central Station. And lo and behold, the rabbi he discovered was an Asian woman rabbi, not quite the prototype of who would control if Jews indeed controlled the world. One would expect a white bearded man looking a little bit like Santa Claus. Instead, he got an Asian woman who is the rabbi, the very able and very terrific rabbi of Central Synagogue, and who all of a sudden found herself in the midst of a drama. But the FBI agent at first could not understand this as a particular directed crime. Later on, it was charged not only as a hostage situation, but also as a hate crime. I trust that dehumanization we understand. Making a person, presuming a person is what? Less than human. Think of it also in terms of all sorts of categories of people whom we treat with a certain measure of disdain and the like. Here's where it becomes the movement in a very basic way is when you get to genocide, is after dehumanization, there is also called organization. Genocide is always organized, usually by the state, sometimes informally by terrorist groups, special army units, or militias, often trained and armed. Plans are made for genocidal killing. It is not an accident. And if you think of the very particular case of Rwanda, you could not kill that many people in that short a span. In Rwanda, the claim is, and I want to be very careful on this because I was in Rwanda shortly after the genocide. The claim is as many as 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. That would mean 8,000 people a day. It's clear whether you accept that figure or not, um, whether you accept that figure or not, and I'm not denying, God forbid, the genocide. I am saying that given the nature of the killing, I'm not sure it was that large. But having said that, that could not happen without systematic organization taking place. And all of you know, in terms of the Holocaust, the full nature of the organization that took place, everything from the first stage of the game, Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units who set out to kill, who rounded up Jews in a village, in a hamlet, in a city, city by city, town by town, person by person, men, women, and children, and killed them at home. And then what you had, and if you want to understand the history of the Holocaust, you understand the second stage of the Holocaust, which took tremendous organization, was this shift of movement. If you can't send the killers to the victims, the next logical step is to make the victims mobile and to send them to stationary killing centers. The stationary killing centers were the death camps. What made the victims mobile were the railroad and the trains, and the camps were built on train lines. And consequently, what you have there is a structural organization all the way through. Think of the Wannsee Conference, those of you who know the Holocaust, and think of that as the moment at which the order had been clearly given and the organization was now set up, where everybody was told that every apparatus of the state and the party would be subordinate to the SS for carrying out this important mission. And that's organization, as the Germans were uniquely capable of organizing it. And consequently, it had a structural organization all the way through. Let me also say, in one sense, and I'm speaking from Warsaw, which was the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. And what is a ghetto? A ghetto was a place to isolate and segregate and separate Jews. And if you asked, what is a ghetto at the beginning was a place to isolate, segregate Jews until. For the Germans, until only became clear later, until a decision was made with what to do with the Jews, and the infrastructure was built to murder them. Warsaw is the best example. The ghetto existed, 400 to 500,000 people were in the ghetto. And then Treblinka was opened on the 23rd of July, 1942. And between the 23rd of July, 1942, and the 21st of September, 1942, right? Between those two dates, more than 265,000 Jews were shipped to Treblinka along a railroad line. The railroad line was the line that connects Warsaw and Białystok, and 99.9999% of those Jews were killed upon arrival. So the ghetto, in retrospect, but not in prospect, was a place to contain the Jews until, one, a decision was made what to do with them, and secondly, the infrastructure was built for their destruction. The Jews inside the ghetto thought the ghetto was a place to be until Germany lost the war, until Germany came to their senses, until somebody liberated us, never imagining that the ghetto was going to be, quotation marks, liquidated and destroyed, and the ghetto then would become a captive place, which was the anteroom to death. Now, again, one can debate whether what comes first, and I don't think he does a very good job of understanding it, but this also should be frightening to us in our world all over the place, which is polarization. Extremists drive Jews apart. Let me give it to you in another very clear way. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler came to power essentially, Hitler in the same period of time in 1933. I could test you, and most of you would fail it in a very particular way. And if you were a class, I'd almost ask you to raise your hand. Most of you would say that Roosevelt came to power on January 20th, 1933. Hitler, we know, came to power on January 30th, 1933. But Franklin Roosevelt came to power on March 4th, 1933. And only after Roosevelt came to power did the American change the date for the presidency, move it forward to January 20th, because it was regarded as too long a transitional time and too dangerous to have a lame duck president for that long a period of time in a time of crisis. And consequently, Hitler preceded Roosevelt by what? 1 and 28 is 29, and 4 is 33 days. They both came to a country which had a 25% unemployment rate and a 40% decline in gross national product. And what was the great difference between Roosevelt and Hitler? Roosevelt turned the society one toward another, and Hitler turned the society one against another. Extremists drive groups apart. Whites and blacks, Jews and Aryans, Hutu and Tutsi, Turks and Armenians, right? Bosnians and Serbs, gangs, right? Gangs only exist with antagonism. What was the great achievement that brought Barack Obama to national attention was his speech in 2004, which said something very important. We don't have red states and blue states. We have the United States of America, which is a sense of the opposite of polarization. Prevention may mean security protection for moderate leaders, assistance to human rights group, assets of extremists may be seized, opportunity for international travel denied them. If extremists try to take over the government, then international sanctions should be in place. But remember that polarization also has a new tool that came after Gregory Stanton made this, which is we have a double tool in our society that fuels and shapes hatred. Number one, we have the internet, which allows us to do all the positive, wonderful, fabulous things that we are doing right now. This could not have existed 10 years ago. But the other thing is we have the social support networks that allows us to say us and them, the groups that we have in one direction or another, and that becomes a critical element. I trust that this is clear. And again, I'm less enamored with his solutions than I am with his identification of what's there. Preparation, organization, and preparation. Again, in the initial formulation, organization and preparation were not separate stages, but very important. National or perpetrated groups plan the final solution. Jewish, Armenian, Tutsi, and other targeted. They use euphemisms to cloak their intention, such as referring their goals as ethnic cleansing, purification, counterterrorism. They build armies, bind weapons, train their troops, militias. They indoctrinate the populace with fear of the victim groups. Leaders often claim, if we do not kill them, if we don't kill them, they will kill us. Prevention or preparation may include arms embargo, commissions to enforce them, should include prosecution, incitement to commit genocide. Both are crimes under the Article 3 of the Genocide Convention. Again, genocide does not occur without organization, and genocide does not occur without preparation. What distinguished the German Commission of Genocide in the Holocaust was the extent of preparation, the duration of that preparation, and the effectiveness of its implementation. Persecution. And again, some of you will say, what the hell is the difference between persecution and discrimination? Well, in this case, what he's saying, victims groups are identified, separated out because of their ethnic or religious identity. Death lists are drawn up. In state-sponsored genocide, members of victims groups may be forced to wear identification symbols. Their property is often confiscated. Sometimes they're segregated into ghettos, deportation to concentration camp, confined to famine-struck regions of starved. Genocidal massacre is about to begin. So this is what he would call persecution. Persecution and discrimination are twins but he's drawing persecution in the most extensive way imaginable. All this leads up to a very important thing, which is the semi-final stage of it, because Stanton is going to surprise you with the final stage of it in a moment, and that is what he calls extermination. Now, I want you to know that extermination is killer language, and extermination is already dehumanization because most of us have exterminators. But what do we use our exterminators for? For vermin, right? I use something called an organization, I won't give its first name, but it's a pest control. And believe me, if I have cockroaches in the house, I want what? I want the exterminator to come. That's why when I do not use Nazi speak, and we're going to see, by the way, that language is one of the ways in which genocide is denied, because the last stage, to hint at it, the last stage of the 10 stages of genocide is denial. But when genocide is denied, when I don't use Nazi speak, I speak of annihilation. Extermination is not what we do to human beings. Extermination already regards them as what? As subhuman, non-human, etc. We are treating them as if vermin. And he writes, at this stage, only rapid and overwhelming armed intervention can stop genocide. Real safe areas or refugee escape regions should be established with heavily armed international protection. And what he's thinking about that is, again, the influence of what happened in Rwanda, where the United Nations troops were confined to base and did not go out to engage in rescue. And what he's thinking about, again, is escape regions. When he speaks about that, the Jews who sought to escape could not find a home that would establish a safety, a haven for them, not in the numbers that were required. And consequently, the problem only got worse. The UN may act through regional military forces from organizations like NATO. Relief groups should be prepared to assist the victims. The UN will not get involved directly. Military powerful nations should provide the airlift equipment, financial means necessary for regional states to intervene with UN authorization. I don't want to go into his sense of prevention or cure, but merely to say, by the time we are in the stage he calls extermination, what you need at that point is armed force. Think of it this way in Rwanda in particular. Number one, in Rwanda, most of the killing was done by machete, not high tech, low tech. Machete also has a terrible thing, which you have to, they're all terrible, but a uniquely terrible thing, which is in order to function with a machete, you have to be within arm's length. And consequently, you look like a butcher's apron by the time a day ends, because the blood that is the head that is severed, bleeds upon you. And the other part of that quotation marks extermination is that the Marines of the United States came in not to stop the genocide, but to save the Americans who were in Rwanda. And the only thing that stopped the genocide was the invasion of groups, almost the equivalent of refugees, the equivalent of groups who had been exiled in the 1960s and who returned in 1994 to what? To fight against the forces of genocide. And this became, again, a shame because the United Nations was there. The United States came in. No intervention against genocide, even though it was singularly low tech. And finally, denial is the 10th stage. It's among the surest indicators of future genocide massacres. Perpetrators dig up the mass graves, burn the body, try to cover up the evidence, intimidate the witnesses. They deny they committed crime and often blame what happened on the victims. They block investigations of the crime, contend that continue to govern until driven from power by force. When they flee into exile, leaders of genocide contribute to continue to deny the crime unless they're captured by tribunals. Establish the best response to denial is punishment by international tribunal and national courts. Their evidence can be heard, perpetrators can be punished. Tribunals or other international courts must be created. They may not prevent reverse genocide killings, but at least some mass murderers may be brought to justice. The other thing about it is they warn future perpetrators that the world will hold them accountable. And remember, there is a line in 1939 when somebody protests the way in which the German invasion of Poland is going to massacre Polish civilians. Hitler is reported to have said, "Who remembers the Armenians?" Because if you remember and if you punish, then somehow that also helps with prevention. Let me say a couple of other things about denial, and then take some questions or comments. And I invite everybody to put these comments into the chat. Right now, I'm going to stop my share so we can see more of you on the screen.
And again, you are welcome to turn on your camera so we can actually see you.
So denial also occurs in language. There is a very interesting thing. The Germans denied what they were doing by using certain language. They called it the final solution to the Jewish problem. And anytime you have a problem, a solution is welcome. And a final solution means you've solved the problem once and for all. The final solution means what? Mass murder, but they don't call it that. They took executive measures, special operations, Einsatzgruppe and Sonderkommando. They used euphemistic language in reporting it to another, right? And by the way, even in innocent ways, we sometimes use language to distort what actually happens. Let me give you my least favorite use of language. Um, we all have heard the word friendly fire. And you got a problem with friendly fire. There's nothing friendly about the fire. Friendly fire is what? Friendly fire is the result of incompetence, irresponsibility, accident, stupidity, right? Wildness, serious and major mistakes. But if somebody ironically is killed by friendly fire, it's almost more painful to imagine than if they're killed by an enemy, because if they're killed by friendly fire, that should be avoidable. An enemy may be not avoidable, but we use such language. In the army, they call stealing liberating. In the camps, ironically, they called stealing organizing because nobody survived for very long without organizing in some which way, manner, or form. So there are all sorts of linguistic tools by which we what? By which we protect ourselves from understanding what we're doing. Let me take some questions now, see what questions have been asked so that we can begin to address your questions and concerns. This is the part that I like the most. To what extent does classification stage reflect state policy and how it's used to justify exclusionary or discriminatory practices in modern societies? The answer is we don't know. We do know, but essentially, classification may be wonderful, may be important as a way to get information and deal with things. It can be used for help. It can be used for assistance, and it's very different with the language that we use, how we use it. Look in school systems, how we began to think differently of students with special needs. That's very different than saying stupid or retarded. And look how we use it with respect. And for example, when we take people with special needs and we give them timeless testing, right? That's very different in terms of classification. We're running into a problem with classification, the way in which we're treating people who are transgender, because where do you deal with the classification? How do you deal with the classification? We also ironically now have a candidate for president who, how are you going to classify her? Are you going to classify in a box which says you're Asian or you're African American? She ironically is a combination of two, but she's not quite African American given where her father came from. And in that sense, what do you say and how do you do, etc. So classification can be by state. Classification can be by all sorts of other other criteria for classification. How does symbolic identification of marginalized group evolve over, trying to see if that's over what? Let me go down a second. Over time, and what does it play in mobilizing violence in 21st century genocides? Symbolic identification can be a very positive thing, or it can be used potentially as a negative thing. And consequently, The question becomes how you're going to use symbolism. I feel that one of the great privileges of being Jewish in my generation was precisely that we could use all sorts of Jewish symbols as a way of affirming a positive identity. We had the freedom, for example, to walk with a kippah, to walk with a yarmulke to synagogue, as today some are afraid to walk precisely with an overt symbol. So classification and symbolization of marginalized groups can evolve positively, can evolve negatively. And one of the reasons Jews were marked, by the way, and symbolized is because you don't quite know who a Jew is. I mean, we have a common joke, funny you don't look Jewish, right? You have blonde haired, blue eyed, Jews, and Hitler was a 5'8", dark haired man. Those of you who have seen Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator understand that Chaplin makes complete fun of the idea that one can look like a dictator, one can look like a barber. They look like the same and they're played by the same character. And all of it is the response of what? Of the public to that classification. Let's go on and see if I can answer some more questions. Let me get them up. How do modern technologies, let me mention something out of personal experience to go back. I was invited to Rwanda by the new government shortly after the genocide to make sure that the genocide could not be denied by teaching them how to both bury the dead and preserve evidence of the crime. Those of you who know Holocaust history know that there was something called Sonderkommando 1005. Sonderkommando 1005 was a group that went in to the mass killing fields where the mobile killing units had operated, where the Holocaust bullets had taken place, dug up the bodies and then burned them to eradicate evidence of the crime. Those of you who have ever been to Treblinka, and I know Ellen has been to Treblinka, understand that there's the picture of the great, not bulldozer, but the great crane that was used to open up the mass graves and to burn the bodies once the Nazis understood that Germany was going to lose the war, to eradicate evidence of the crime. I was called in when the mass graves were still open. I was called in with a number of other people to teach the Rwandese how to document so that we understood and completely understood what had happened and we preserved evidence of the crime. How can international governments such as the United States or regional coalitions effectively intervene during an organized phase to prevent escalation into genocide? The answer is the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that they have been thoroughly and completely and totally ineffective in virtually every genocide in the last half of the 20th century and the 21st century. And we had very specific evidence during the genocides in the former Yugoslavia that one of the things the State Department tried to do was to not use the G word. The G word is the genocide word because once you use the G word, there is the expectation that you're going to do something about genocide. And consequently, they did not use the G word. And the only way to combat genocide at a very specific point is by physical force. So we have not had an effective use of the United Nations. We have not had regional forces. And the United Nations tries one thing that sometimes it succeeds at and sometimes it doesn't succeed at. And that is that it tries to use peacekeeping forces to separate and prevent, but it doesn't use them as aggressive against the commission of genocide. Now, you had a very interesting thing that took place in the use of diplomacy in the case of the former Yugoslavia, which is that Richard Holbrooke, who was then working for the State Department, brought the leaders of these countries to Dayton, Ohio. And with all due respect to Dayton, Ohio, he didn't put them in the Hilton and he didn't put them in the Four Seasons. He put them on a military base with minimal positive recreational or services or anything like that, not like being in a plush hotel, and essentially said, you guys are going to come to a decision or you ain't going to get out of here very quickly. And he took away their means of external communication, and everybody came to the conclusion that the Dayton Accords, they all felt that they had lost something, but they came to the conclusion that somebody else had lost more. And that was an example of diplomacy at its toughest. And Richard Holbrooke, who was a friend, was not kind and gentle in dealing with anybody, perhaps except for his wife and his children, both of whom adored him. But kindness and gentleness was not Richard Holbrooke's way. And he used the tools of diplomacy and the powers of the United States to go against genocide in a very basic way. Let's take some more questions, and some of you who have questions have additional questions can ask them. What are the long-term socio-political and cultural consequences of this polarization, particularly in terms of perpetrating violence, undermining reconciliation efforts, and destabilizing post-conflict societies? By the way, I want to make another correction to Stanton. In addition to judicial process, we had one more model of a way to grapple with it, which is the model that was used in South Africa, which was not a genocide. But in South Africa, they used something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was based not on a judicial model, but on a religious model. The religious model was confession and repentance. And the other part of the genius, it was the opposite of a judicial process. The judicial process tries the people at the top, and truth and reconciliation began at the bottom with the ordinary perpetrator and said, if you confess and you implicate those who were above you, then reconciliation can take place. So one was a top-down punishment base, the other was a confessional base going from the bottom up. Let's go back. Long-term social and cultural consequences of this polarization. I think polarization, the opposite of polarization, is the recognition of commonality. And the recognition of commonality is critically important. Even if you say we're both human beings, all of a sudden you've breached something. When you say, I'm a father, he's a father, I'm a mother, she's a mother, we both had parents who loved us, we both have children we love, all of a sudden that goes a very long way, right? That goes a very long way to ending polarization. Think of one of the magnificent moments in American politics, which would have great difficulty taking place today, when John McCain said, no, no, no. Barack Obama is a man I have disagreements with, but he's a family man and a decent man, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not condemning him, and I'm not condemning him and his basic human decency. I'm saying we disagree. That's a radically different step than the type of polarization which regards the others, to use Hillary Clinton's word, as deplorable, or what, enemies of the state, or whatever have you, in all sorts of ways. Polarization is dangerous, and we saw polarization extremely in the Nazi universe, where in the buildup of 1919 to 1933, what you had was the collapse of the middle, and you had violence on both sides. The polarization of communism on the left and Nazism on the right, which drew what? Drew out all of the violence and got rid of the mainstream in a very basic way. Its polarization is essentially destabilizing, and it's certainly, the more you have it, the more it what? It undermines the possibility of reconciliation. In recent genocides, such as Darfur and Darfur, what were the triggers that marked the shift from persecution to active extermination? The case in Rwanda is absolutely clear, because that was the downing of the presidential plane and the loss of two presidents on the presidential plane. That became the trigger, that became the element that set it forth. In Bosnia, what you had was, again, under Yugoslavia, a series of multiple nations were forced under one flag by Tito. And essentially, with the collapse of that force, polarization took place, and ancient, long held ethnic differences became paramount. I have to think of the answer with Darfur, and frankly, I would not be able to answer that question at this point. But I once taught at the Naval Academy, and they had a wonderful response if somebody did not know the answer. They said, "Do not know, sir, but we'll find out, sir." And your obligation was to write down the question that you had asked and the answer, and who did not know how to answer it. And the beginning of the next session, you had to answer those questions. And when you answered those questions, the ethic was that an officer need not know everything, but an officer and the midshipmen and women were training to be officers. An officer could not be satisfied with ignorance. And I love that as an ethic. And I've tried to impose that in some of my classes, with the idea that we can't be satisfied with ignorance. So I will have to answer the question with Darfur next time, and hold me to it, please, whoever asked that question. Let's see if we have any other questions. I think I've gone through the questions, unless people want to raise their hands and signal that they have questions to ask. Okay, next time we will go through what Ellen announced would be the topic for today. and I will take personal responsibility for making a liar out of Ellen. It is not her fault. It is my fault, and frankly, it's my fault in a very different way because I bought a brand new computer, and I apparently am less technologically sophisticated than I thought I was because I thought I had transferred everything, and I had not yet transferred everything. So I couldn't move on the turn of the introduction and get uh, deal with that, but that will be done next time, and I will answer the question on therefore. All yours, Ellen,
Fantastic.
and thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael. There's so many complexities with 21st century technology, from time change to new computers. So it's no wonder that we can navigate these technologies. As we conclude the second session of Understanding Genocide, History, Causes, and Responses, we are very grateful for Dr. Michael Berenbaum's insightful exploration into the 10 stages of genocide. His expertise continue to deepen our understanding of how these stages unfold and how we can recognize the warning signs in today's world. We hope today's discussion has furthered your knowledge and inspired critical reflection on the importance of vigilance and actions in preventing future atrocities. We look forward to seeing you at our next session on November 13th, when everyone will have turned their clocks. So thank you for your engagement and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Michael, I hope you enjoy your dinner. Bye, everyone.